How to think in the right way so as not to destroy yourself. You are not being destroyed by your life. You are being destroyed by the way you think about it. Right now, without noticing, your mind is working against you in ways that feel completely natural. It takes small situations and amplifies them. A simple delay becomes anxiety. A neutral silence becomes rejection. A minor mistake becomes proof that you are failing. And because this happens so quickly, you never stop to question it. You assume your thoughts are telling you the truth. But they are not. What you call thinking is often just a chain reaction of conditioned responses, built over years of repetition, fear, comparison, and emotional habits. You are not analyzing reality. You are interpreting it through patterns that were never designed to serve you. And the most dangerous part is this feels familiar, which makes it feel correct. Epictetus taught that it is not things themselves that disturb us, but the opinions we form about them. That single idea changes everything, because it means your suffering is not coming from the outside world. It is being generated internally through meaning you assign without awareness. Every time something happens, your mind rushes to label it, good or bad, safe or dangerous, success or failure. And once that label is attached, your emotions follow automatically. There is no space, no pause, no control. You feel what your mind decides before you even realize a decision was made. That is how people lose themselves without ever noticing. Not through one big mistake, but through thousands of small, unchecked thoughts that slowly shape how they see everything. You were never taught to observe your mind. You were never trained to question your thoughts. You were never shown how to separate reality from interpretation. So you accepted everything as truth, and over time, that truth became your identity. If your thoughts are chaotic, your life will feel chaotic. If your thoughts are fearful, your life will feel threatening. If your thoughts are negative, your reality will reflect that negativity, regardless of what is actually happening around you. This is why two people can face the same situation and experience completely different emotional realities. One feels pressure, the other feels opportunity. One sees loss, the other sees direction. The difference is not the event, it is the thinking behind it. If you do not learn how to think properly, your mind will continue creating problems that do not exist, turning ordinary moments into emotional weight, and slowly exhausting your energy from within. But if you learn to see your thoughts clearly, without immediately believing them, something shifts. You begin to create distance, and in that distance, you find control. Not control over the world, control over yourself. And everything begins with something so subtle that most people never even realize it is happening. The silent self-sabotage. You don't notice. There is a voice inside you that never stops talking. It comments on everything. It judges, predicts, compares, criticizes, and warns. And because it has been with you for so long, you stopped questioning it. You started trusting it. This is where self-sabotage truly begins. Not in your actions, but in the silent agreement you make with your own thoughts. You wake up and a thought appears. You are already behind. You are not doing enough. Others are ahead. Something will go wrong today. These thoughts do not feel like suggestions. They feel like facts. And because you do not challenge them, they become the foundation of your emotional state. Marcus Aurelius wrote in Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, Book 2, Paragraph 1, that your mind will take the shape of what you frequently hold in thought. This is not philosophy for reflection. This is a direct warning. Every repeated thought is shaping who you are becoming. The danger is not the presence of negative thoughts. The danger is your automatic acceptance of them. You do not pause to ask if they are true. You do not examine where they came from. You do not question their validity. You absorb them instantly, and once absorbed, they begin to influence everything. Your mood shifts, your energy drops, your behavior adjusts. Your decisions become smaller, safer, more limited, and all of this happens before you are even aware that a thought has taken control. This is why self-sabotage feels invisible. You are not choosing to hold yourself back consciously. You are being guided by patterns that were never challenged. Over time, These patterns create a version of reality that feels heavy and restrictive. You begin to believe life is harder than it is, that opportunities are fewer than they are, that you are less capable than you truly are. Not because it is true, but because your thinking keeps reinforcing it. Most people believe they are responding to reality. In truth, they are responding to interpretations that were never verified. They live inside conclusions they never questioned. And as this cycle repeats day after day, it builds a mental environment where doubt feels normal, pressure feels constant, and clarity feels distant. But here is the part most people never stop to consider. If these thoughts are shaping your life, then why are they always leading you in the same direction? Why do they repeat the same fears, the same doubts, the same limitations? And more importantly, what if your mind is not just reacting automatically? What if it is actually choosing something you have never examined? Why your mind prefers chaos over clarity. Your mind does not naturally seek peace, it seeks survival. And survival, by design, is not calm, not rational, and not balanced. It is alert, reactive, and constantly scanning for what could go wrong. This is why, even when nothing is happening, your mind creates something to worry about. You call it thinking. But in reality, it is anticipation mixed with fear. The human mind was not built to keep you happy. It was built to keep you alive. And to do that, it prioritizes potential threats over present stability. That means it will always pay more attention to what is uncertain, uncomfortable, or negative. This is why clarity feels unnatural at first. Clarity requires stillness. It requires observation without immediate reaction. It requires you to step back and evaluate instead of jumping to conclusions. But your mind has been trained to do the opposite. It rushes. It fills gaps with assumptions. It prefers a negative answer over no answer at all, because uncertainty feels dangerous. So instead of saying, "I don't know what this means," your mind says, "This is bad." Instead of waiting, it concludes. Instead of observing, it reacts. And once that reaction happens, your body follows. Your emotions align with that interpretation, even if it was never accurate. Seneca warned in Letters from a Stoic, letter 13, that we suffer more in imagination than in reality. This is exactly what is happening here. Your mind is not responding to what is real, it is responding to what it predicts. And those predictions are rarely neutral. They are exaggerated, distorted, and often completely disconnected from what is actually happening. You begin to live in a constant state of internal tension, not because your life is chaotic, but because your thinking is. Chaos becomes your default state, not external chaos, but internal noise. Thoughts jumping from one concern to another, questions without answers, scenarios that never happen but feel real enough to affect your emotions. And the longer this pattern continues, the more familiar it becomes. Eventually, calm starts to feel strange. Silence feels uncomfortable. Stillness feels unnatural. You reach for distractions. You return to thinking. You create movement in your mind just to avoid the discomfort of clarity. Because clarity forces you to face something most people avoid. The realization that many of your thoughts are unnecessary. That they are not helping you, not protecting you, not guiding you. They are simply repeating. And once you begin to see this, a new question appears. If your mind is constantly generating noise, how much of what you call thinking is actually just reaction? The illusion of thinking versus the reality of reacting. You believe you are thinking, but most of the time you are reacting. There is a difference, and it changes everything. Thinking requires distance. It requires you to step back, observe, question, and then decide. Reaction happens instantly. It is automatic, emotional, and unexamined. And the problem is that reaction feels like thinking. That is the illusion. A situation happens. Someone says something. Something does not go as expected. And immediately, your mind produces a conclusion. This is bad. This is unfair. This means something is wrong. And before you even realize it, your body responds. Your mood shifts. Your energy drops. Your behavior changes. You never stop to analyze. You never verified the meaning. You never asked if your interpretation was accurate. You reacted. Epictetus made this distinction clear in Discourses of Epictetus, Book 1, Chapter 11, when he explained that people are not disturbed by events, but by the judgments they form about those events. The judgment is the reaction, and most of the time it happens without awareness. This is how the illusion is created. Because the reaction is so fast, you assume it is valid. Because it feels real, you assume it is true, but feeling is not proof. Speed is not accuracy. What you call thinking is often just your mind repeating familiar emotional patterns in response to external triggers. You are not choosing your response. You are replaying it. And the more you repeat these reactions, the stronger they become. They turn into default pathways. Shortcuts your mind uses to save time. But those shortcuts come at a cost. They remove your ability to choose. You stop responding consciously and start operating automatically. The same situations produce the same emotions. The same triggers lead to the same behaviors. And over time, your life becomes predictable in the worst way. Not because reality is limited, but because your reactions are. Marcus Aurelius reflected in Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, Book 8, Paragraph 47, that if you are distressed by anything external, the pain is not due to the thing itself, but to your estimate of it. That estimate is your reaction. And if you never question it, it becomes your reality. This is where people lose control without realizing it. They believe they are making decisions, but they are following emotional impulses. They believe they are thinking clearly, but they are reacting quickly. They believe they understand their situation, but they are trapped inside interpretations they never examined. And as long as this continues, nothing changes. Because you cannot change your life if you are not aware of how you are responding to it. Real thinking begins the moment you interrupt this process. The moment you pause. The moment you separate what happened from what you think it means. But that creates discomfort, because once you stop reacting automatically, you are left with something unfamiliar. Silence. And in that silence, you begin to notice something that was always there. The patterns. The repetitions, the same thoughts, returning again and again, shaping your perception without your permission. And that leads to a deeper problem most people never question. If your reactions are not random, why do they always follow the same direction? The dangerous comfort of negative thought patterns. There is a reason you keep thinking the same way, even when it hurts you. It feels familiar, and what is familiar feels safe, even when it is slowly destroying you. Negative thought patterns do not stay in your mind because they are true. They stay because they are repeated. Over time, repetition creates comfort. Not a healthy comfort, but a predictable one. You know how it feels to doubt yourself. You know how it feels to expect the worst. You know how it feels to assume something will go wrong. And because you know it, your mind returns to it. This is where the real danger begins. You stop questioning these patterns not because they make sense, but because they feel normal. You wake up already expecting pressure. You enter situations already expecting problems. You interpret neutral moments as negative without even noticing it. It becomes your baseline. Seneca warned in Letters from a Stoic, Letter 10, that a mind that is anxious about the future is miserable even before anything happens. That anxiety becomes a habit. And once it becomes a habit, it no longer feels like something you are doing. It feels like something you are. That is the shift that traps people. A thought becomes a pattern becomes a mindset becomes an identity. And once it reaches identity, you stop seeing it as something you can change. You start saying things like, this is just how I am. This is how I think. This is how life is. But it is not. It is how you have trained your mind to operate. Every time you expect the worst, you reinforce the pattern. Every time you assume failure, you strengthen it. Every time you interpret uncertainty as danger, you deepen the cycle. And slowly your mind becomes conditioned to reject clarity. Because clarity feels unfamiliar. Clarity does not assume the worst, it waits, it observes, it questions. But your mind has been trained to move fast, to conclude quickly, to fill every gap with something negative. So when clarity appears, it feels uncomfortable. You start thinking something is wrong. You search for problems that are not there. You return to old patterns just to feel grounded again. This is why people stay stuck. Not because they cannot change, but because change feels unstable compared to what they already know. Epictetus explained in Discourses of Epictetus, Book 2, Chapter 18, that we become what we repeatedly practice. This includes your thinking. If you practice doubt, you become doubt. If you practice fear, you become fear. And if you practice negative interpretation long enough, it becomes your default way of seeing the world. At that point, reality no longer matters. You are not seeing what is happening. You are seeing what your patterns allow you to see. And this creates a dangerous illusion. You believe your thoughts are protecting you. You believe expecting the worst makes you prepared. You believe analyzing every possibility keeps you in control. But in truth, these patterns are not protecting you. They are limiting you. They keep you in a constant state of tension, always preparing for something that rarely happens, always reacting to interpretations that were never verified. And the more you rely on these patterns, the harder it becomes to step outside them. Because now the question is no longer just about your thoughts, it is about trust. If your mind has been repeating the same negative patterns for years, how do you know when it is telling the truth, and when it is simply repeating what it has always said? When your thoughts start lying to you, there comes a point where your mind stops reflecting reality and starts rewriting it, not in obvious ways, not in ways you can easily detect, but in subtle distortions that feel completely convincing. A look becomes judgment, a delay becomes rejection, a mistake becomes failure, and because these interpretations happen instantly, you never stop to question them. You assume your thoughts are accurate, but they are not always telling you the truth. Your mind does not operate like a neutral observer. It operates like a narrator. It takes fragments of reality and fills in the gaps with assumptions, often influenced by past experiences, fears, and patterns you have repeated for years. And once that narrative is formed, it feels real. Marcus Aurelius wrote in Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, Book 4, Paragraph 3, that if you are distressed by something external, the cause is not the thing itself, but your judgment about it. That judgment is where distortion begins. You see something happen, and before you can evaluate it, your mind assigns meaning. That meaning is rarely neutral. It leans toward negativity, toward caution, toward self-protection. But in doing so, it often creates a version of reality that is exaggerated or completely inaccurate. You begin to believe things that were never proven. You believe people are against you without evidence. You believe situations are worse than they are. You believe your future is already decided based on a single moment. And because these thoughts feel strong, you treat them as facts. This is how your mind lies to you, not by inventing something entirely new, but by twisting what is already there. It removes context. It ignores alternative explanations. It selects the interpretation that aligns with your existing patterns and presents it as truth. And once you accept it, your emotions follow immediately. You feel stress, anxiety, frustration, or fear, all based on something that was never fully examined. Epictetus explained in Enchiridion of Epictetus, paragraph 5, that it is not events that disturb people, but the judgments they make about those events. If those judgments are flawed, then your emotional response will also be flawed. But here is what makes this dangerous. You rarely question your own thoughts, you question other people, you question situations, you question outcomes. But when a thought appears in your mind, you accept it immediately, as if it came from a reliable source. You do not ask if it is accurate. You do not ask if it is useful. You do not ask if it is based on evidence or assumption. You believe it, and the more you believe it, the more your mind reinforces it. It starts looking for proof, filtering reality to confirm what you already think. This creates a closed loop, where your thoughts shape your perception, and your perception strengthens your thoughts. Over time, this loop becomes your reality. You are no longer seeing what is happening. You are seeing what your mind has decided is happening. This is why two people can experience the same situation and come to completely different conclusions. One sees opportunity, the other sees threat. One feels calm, The other feels pressure. The difference is not the event, it is the interpretation. And if your interpretations are built on distortion, your entire emotional experience becomes unstable. You react to things that were never real. You prepare for outcomes that never arrive. You limit yourself based on beliefs that were never tested. All because your mind told you something and you accepted it. But if your thoughts can lie to you, then how many of the things you believe about yourself are actually true? And more importantly, what happens when you finally stop believing every thought that appears? The hidden addiction to overthinking. You think you are trying to solve your problems. In reality, you may be feeding them. Overthinking does not feel like a problem at first. It feels like effort. It feels like control. It feels like you are being responsible, careful, aware. You go over the same situation again and again, analyzing every detail, imagining different outcomes, trying to find the perfect answer. But there is a point where thinking stops being useful and becomes repetitive. That is where the addiction begins. Your mind starts to believe that more thinking will lead to more clarity. But instead it creates more confusion. Every new thought introduces a new possibility, a new doubt, a new concern. And instead of reaching a conclusion, you get pulled deeper into the process. You are no longer solving, you are circling. Seneca warned in Letters from a Stoic, letter 56, that the mind is often disturbed not by real problems, but by imagined ones that it keeps revisiting. This is exactly what overthinking does. It takes something simple and stretches it into something complex, and the more you engage with it, the more it grows. What makes this dangerous is that overthinking creates the illusion of productivity. You feel like you are doing something. You feel like you are making progress. But in reality, you are reinforcing the habit of not deciding. You delay action. You postpone clarity. You wait for certainty that never arrives, and your mind becomes dependent on that process. You return to the same thoughts not because they are useful, but because they are familiar. Because thinking feels safer than acting. Because analyzing feels less risky than deciding. This is how overthinking turns into a cycle. You face a situation. You begin to think. The thinking creates more questions. The questions create more uncertainty. The uncertainty leads to more thinking. And the loop continues. At no point do you step out of it. Epictetus explained in Discourses of Epictetus, Book 2, Chapter 1, that we often add unnecessary layers to simple situations, making them harder than they are. Overthinking is exactly that. It is the addition of unnecessary complexity. You take what is already enough and make it overwhelming. And the longer this continues, the harder it becomes to stop. Because now, your mind expects it. It expects you to question everything. It expects you to analyze every possibility. It expects you to revisit decisions even after they have been made. And if you try to stop, you feel uncomfortable. You feel like you are missing something. You feel like you are being careless. But in truth, what you are missing is not more thinking. It is clarity. Clarity does not come from adding more thoughts. It comes from removing the unnecessary ones. But your mind resists that. Because if you stop overthinking, you are forced to face something direct. A decision, and decisions require responsibility. They require you to accept that you cannot control every outcome, that you cannot predict everything, that you must act with incomplete information. And for a mind addicted to control, that feels dangerous. So it returns to thinking, again and again. But if overthinking is not helping you move forward, why does your mind keep pulling you back into it? The moment you lost control of your mind, there was a moment when your mind stopped being something you used and started becoming something that uses you. Not a dramatic moment, not something you noticed. It happened gradually, through repetition, through habit, through years of accepting thoughts without questioning them. At some point, you stopped observing your mind and started identifying with it. A thought appeared, and instead of seeing it as a possibility, you saw it as truth. Instead of analyzing it, you followed it. Instead of choosing your response, you allowed it to decide for you. That is the moment control begins to slip. Marcus Aurelius wrote in Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, Book 5, Paragraph 16. that the mind becomes dyed with the color of its thoughts. This means your internal world is not neutral. It is shaped continuously by what you allow to remain in it. And if you never filter what enters, everything stays. Every doubt, every fear, every assumption, every exaggerated conclusion. Over time, these accumulate. They form patterns. They create tendencies. They begin to influence how you see yourself, how you see others, how you interpret every situation, and eventually, they begin to operate without your permission. You wake up already thinking in a certain direction. You enter situations already expecting certain outcomes. You react in ways that feel automatic, as if there is no space between the event and your response. That space is where control exists. And when that space disappears, you are no longer choosing. You are following. Epictetus explained in Discourses of Epictetus, Book 3, Chapter 2, that freedom is the ability to control your own mind, not external events. If your thoughts are automatic and unexamined, that freedom is already compromised, because you are no longer directing your thinking. You are experiencing it, and there is a difference. When you direct your mind, you decide what deserves attention, what deserves energy, what deserves belief. When you experience your mind without control, everything that appears feels equally important. Every thought demands attention. Every idea feels urgent. Every emotion feels justified. This creates internal noise, a constant flow of impressions that you never stop to organize, question, or filter. And within that noise, your ability to think clearly begins to disappear. You confuse intensity with truth. The stronger a thought feels, the more you believe it. But intensity is not accuracy. It is just repetition mixed with emotion. The more you repeat a thought, the more familiar it becomes. The more familiar it becomes, the more convincing it feels. And eventually you stop questioning it altogether. That is how control is lost. Not because you chose to lose it, but because you never realized you had it. You assumed your thoughts were you. But they are not. They are inputs. And if you never learn how to manage them, they will continue shaping your reality without your awareness. This is why people feel trapped inside their own minds. Not because they cannot change their situation, but because they cannot step outside their thinking long enough to see it clearly. And once you realize that you are not in control, a new question appears. If your mind has been running automatically this entire time, what would it take to take control back? Why awareness alone is not enough. At some point, you start to notice what is happening inside your mind. You recognize the patterns. You see the negative thoughts. You catch yourself overthinking. You begin to understand that your reactions are not always accurate, and for a moment it feels like progress. You think awareness is enough, but it is not. Awareness shows you the problem. It does not solve it. You can see your thoughts clearly and still follow them. You can recognize a negative pattern and still repeat it. You can understand that your mind is exaggerating and still feel controlled by it, because knowing is passive. Control requires action. Epictetus made this clear in Discourses of Epictetus, Book 1, Chapter 26, when he explained that understanding philosophy is not the same as applying it. You can know what is right and still fail to do it, if you have not trained yourself to act differently. This is where most people stop. They become aware of their thinking, but they do not intervene. They watch their thoughts, but they do not challenge them. They notice their reactions, but they do not interrupt them. They observe the pattern, but they allow it to continue. And because of that, nothing changes. Awareness without action becomes frustration. You start to feel like you understand your mind, but you are still controlled by it. You see the problem, but you cannot stop it. You recognize the pattern, but you feel stuck inside it. This creates a new layer of pressure. Now you are not only dealing with your thoughts, but also with the awareness that you are not managing them effectively, and that can feel even heavier. Seneca warned in Letters from a Stoic, Letter 95, that knowledge without practice is useless. The same applies here. Seeing your thoughts is only the first step. Changing your relationship with them is what creates real control, and that requires effort. It requires you to do something uncomfortable, to pause when your mind wants to react, to question when your mind wants to conclude, to stay still when your mind wants to rush. This is not natural at first, because your mind is used to speed. It is used to automatic responses. It is used to moving from thought to emotion without interruption. When you try to slow it down, it resists. It pushes harder. It creates urgency. It tells you that you need to decide now, react now, think more, analyze more. And if you are not prepared for that resistance, you fall back into the pattern. That is why awareness alone fails. It does not give you the tools to handle that resistance. It does not train you to act differently in the moment. It only shows you what is happening. But if you want to take control of your mind, you need to go further. You need to create space between the thought and your response, because that space is where change becomes possible. Without it, everything remains automatic. And if everything remains automatic, how do you ever choose a different direction? The gap between thought and reality. There is something happening inside your mind that you rarely notice. A gap. A space so small that it feels like it does not exist, but powerful enough to change everything if you learn how to use it. This gap exists between what happens and what you think it means. An event occurs. Someone says something. Something does not go as expected. That is reality. It is neutral. It simply exists. But almost instantly your mind steps in and assigns meaning. This is where the gap disappears. You do not see the event and the interpretation as separate. You merge them. You treat your thought about what happened as if it were the event itself. And from that moment on, you are no longer responding to reality. You are responding to your version of it. Epictetus explained in Enchiridion of Epictetus, paragraph 1, that some things are in our control and others are not. Events are not in your control, but your judgments about those events are. That judgment is formed inside this gap. If you are not aware of it, your mind fills it automatically. It assigns meaning based on past patterns, fears, and expectations. And because it happens so quickly, you never question it. You feel the result as if it were inevitable. But it is not. There is always a moment, even if it is brief, where you can intervene. A moment where you can pause and ask a different question. Not, why is this happening to me, but what is actually happening here? This question separates reality from interpretation. Reality is simple. It is direct. It does not carry emotional weight until you attach meaning to it. Interpretation is complex. It adds layers, assumptions, conclusions that may not be accurate. When you fail to see the gap, interpretation takes over. When you recognize the gap, you regain control. Marcus Aurelius wrote in Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, Book 8, paragraph 36, that if you are troubled by anything, it is not the thing itself, but your judgment about it, and this you have the power to revoke at any moment. That power exists in this space, but most people never use it. They move too fast. They allow thoughts to form and solidify before they can examine them. They accept the first interpretation that appears, without considering that it might be incomplete or incorrect. And once that interpretation is accepted, everything follows. Emotion, reaction, behavior, all based on something that was never questioned. This is how small moments turn into large problems, not because the situation is severe, but because the meaning attached to it is exaggerated. You feel overwhelmed not by what is happening, but by what you believe it represents. And if you continue to ignore this gap, the pattern continues. Every situation becomes filtered through automatic interpretation. Every event becomes loaded with unnecessary meaning. Every reaction becomes predictable. But if you begin to notice this space, even for a second, something changes. You start to see that your thoughts are not the same as reality, that they are just one possible explanation among many. And that realization creates distance. Distance from the thought, distance from the emotion, distance from the automatic reaction. And within that distance you find something you did not have before. Choice. But now that you see the gap, what happens when the first thought appears? Rewriting the first thought that appears. Everything begins with the first thought, not the second, not the third, not the long chain that follows. The first one. the one that appears instantly, before you have time to analyze, before you even realize it has arrived. That thought sets the direction. If it is negative, everything that follows will try to support it. If it is distorted, your emotions will align with that distortion. If it is exaggerated, your reaction will reflect that exaggeration. And because it comes so fast, you rarely question it. You accept it. That is where the entire process begins. Epictetus taught in Discourses of Epictetus, Book 3, Chapter 8, that when an impression appears, you should not immediately accept it, but examine it. This is the moment most people miss. The moment when the thought is still flexible, still open to change. Once you accept it, it becomes harder to alter. The problem is not that the first thought appears. That is automatic. The problem is what you do next. You either reinforce it or you interrupt it. If you reinforce it, you follow it without question. You let it expand, connect to other thoughts, build a narrative. And within seconds, you are no longer dealing with a single idea, but with a full emotional state. But if you interrupt it, something different happens. You create space. You take that first thought and you look at it directly, without immediately believing it. You ask a simple question: is this true, or is this just my first reaction? That question changes the direction, because now, instead of being inside the thought, you are observing it. And from that position, you can reshape it. Not by forcing positivity, not by denying reality, but by correcting distortion. If your mind says this is going to go wrong, you respond with, what do I actually know right now? If your mind says this means failure, you respond with, is there another explanation? If your mind says this is a problem, you respond with, what is the actual fact here? You are not replacing the thought blindly. You are refining it. Marcus Aurelius wrote in Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, Book 11, Paragraph 18, that you have the power to remove many unnecessary judgments. This is exactly what you are doing here. You are not trying to control everything. You are removing what is inaccurate. And that changes your emotional response. Because emotions do not come directly from events. They come from the meaning you assign to those events. When you adjust the meaning, the emotion adjusts with it. What once felt overwhelming becomes manageable. What once felt threatening becomes neutral. What once triggered reaction becomes something you can observe calmly. But this requires practice, because your mind is used to speed. It wants to move forward, to build the story, to create conclusions. When you slow it down, it resists. It pushes you to accept the first thought and move on. That is the challenge, to stay in that moment long enough to intervene, to recognize that the first thought is not final, that it is just the beginning of a process you can influence. And the more you practice this, the more control you gain. You begin to notice patterns earlier. You catch thoughts before they expand. You reduce the intensity of your reactions. You create a different internal rhythm, one that is not driven by impulse, but by awareness and choice. And over time, this changes how you experience everything, because now, instead of being carried by your thoughts, you are directing them. But if you can change the first thought, what happens when you choose not to react at all? The power of mental non-reaction. You have been taught that reacting is natural, that when something happens, you should respond immediately, that your first emotional impulse is valid, that expressing it quickly is honest, even necessary. But what if your greatest strength is not in reacting, but in not reacting at all? Mental non-reaction is not suppression. It is not ignoring what you feel. It is the ability to experience a thought or emotion without being controlled by it. That distinction changes everything. When something happens, your mind produces a reaction. That part is automatic. But what you do with that reaction is where your control exists. Most people do not see this. They feel something and they act on it instantly. They speak, they decide, they judge, all based on the first wave of emotion. And because that wave is intense, it feels justified. But intensity is not accuracy. Epictetus taught in Discourses of Epictetus, Book 2, Chapter 18, that when impressions arise, we must not be carried away by them, but examine them before giving our assent. That pause, that moment of non-reaction, is where your power begins. When you do not react immediately, you create distance. Distance from the thought, distance from the emotion, distance from the impulse. And in that distance, something becomes possible. Clarity. You start to see that the initial reaction is only one version of reality, not the final one. You begin to notice that emotions rise and fall, that thoughts appear and disappear, that not everything requires a response. This is where most people struggle. Because non-reaction feels uncomfortable. It feels like inaction. It feels like you are doing nothing. It feels like you are losing control. But in reality, you are gaining it. You are choosing not to be driven by the first impulse. You are allowing yourself time to observe before deciding. Seneca wrote in Letters from a Stoic, letter 85, that the greatest remedy for anger is delay. That idea extends beyond anger. Delay is the remedy for most destructive reactions. When you delay, you weaken the impulse. What felt urgent begins to lose intensity. What felt overwhelming becomes manageable. What felt like something you had to act on immediately starts to look different when you give it time. And often, you realize something important, that the reaction was not necessary, that the thought did not require action, that the situation did not demand the emotional response you were about to give. This is how control is rebuilt. Not by forcing your mind to stop producing thoughts, but by refusing to follow them automatically, by choosing when to engage and when to let them pass. And the more you practice this, the more stable you become. Situations that once triggered you lose their power. Words that once affected you deeply begin to feel neutral. Events that once caused stress no longer dominate your internal state, because you are no longer reacting to everything. You are selecting your responses. And that creates a different kind of strength. Not loud, not visible, not reactive, but stable, unshaken, and increasingly independent from external circumstances. But non-reaction alone is not enough. Because if you are not reacting, what determines which thoughts you accept? Building an internal filter for every thought. If you do not choose your thoughts will choose you. Every idea that enters your mind is asking for something: attention, belief, energy. And if you accept all of them without question, you lose control over what shapes your inner world. That is why you need a filter. Not to block thinking, but to evaluate it. Right now, most of your thoughts pass through without resistance. They appear, and you accept them instantly. You treat them as valid simply because they exist. But not every thought deserves to stay. Some are incomplete. Some are exaggerated. Some are based on fear, not reality. And if you do not filter them, they accumulate. Marcus Aurelius wrote in Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, Book 8, paragraph 49, that you must constantly examine your impressions and not be carried away by them. This examination is your filter. It is the process of deciding what is useful and what is not. When a thought appears, instead of accepting it immediately, you bring it into awareness and ask direct questions. Is this based on fact or assumption? Is this helping me or limiting me? Is this necessary or is it just noise? These questions slow the process down. They prevent automatic acceptance, and they give you the ability to decide. Epictetus emphasized in Discourses of Epictetus, Book 1, Chapter 20, that the first task is to not accept impressions without testing them. That is the role of this filter. To test every thought before it becomes part of your belief system. Because once a thought is accepted, it begins to influence everything. It affects how you feel. It shapes how you act. It directs your attention. And over time, it reinforces patterns that define your mindset. If the thought is accurate and useful, it strengthens clarity. If it is distorted and negative, it strengthens confusion. Without a filter, both are treated the same. With a filter, you begin to separate them. You start to recognize that not every thought deserves your energy, that some ideas can be observed and released without engagement, that others need to be corrected before they grow. This creates a different internal environment. one where your mind is not crowded with unnecessary noise, one where your thinking becomes more precise, one where your emotional responses are not driven by random impressions, but by evaluated ones. But this requires consistency, because your mind will continue producing thoughts automatically. It will continue offering interpretations, predictions, assumptions. The filter does not stop this process. It manages it. It gives you control over what stays and what goes. And over time, this changes how you think. You become less reactive, less overwhelmed, less influenced by the first idea that appears. You develop a sense of stability because your thoughts are no longer random. They are selected. And this selection becomes a habit, a discipline, because clarity is not something that appears once. It is something you maintain. But if controlling your thoughts requires discipline, what happens when your mind is not in the right mood to do it? Training your mind like a discipline, not a mood. If you only control your thoughts when you feel like it, you will never control them when it matters. Most people treat mental control like motivation. They try to think clearly when they feel calm. They try to be rational when they feel inspired. They try to apply what they know only when it is easy. But the moments that define your life are not the easy ones. They are the moments of pressure, of uncertainty, of emotional intensity. And in those moments, you do not rise to what you know. You fall back to what you have practiced. Epictetus made this clear in Discourses of Epictetus, Book 1, Chapter 24, when he explained that you do not become strong by thinking about philosophy, but by training yourself to apply it in real situations. Mental control is not theoretical. It is practical. And practice requires consistency. It requires you to engage with your thoughts every day, not just when something goes wrong. To question them when they are small, so you are prepared when they become intense. To build the habit of observation, interruption, and correction until it becomes automatic. Because without training, your mind returns to default patterns. When you are tired, you react. When you are stressed, you assume. When you are uncertain, you overthink. Not because you choose to, but because that is what your mind has learned to do. Discipline changes that. Discipline means you do not wait to feel ready. You act anyway. You question your thoughts even when it is uncomfortable. You pause even when your mind wants to rush. You choose clarity even when confusion feels easier. Seneca wrote in Letters from a Stoic, letter 78, that difficulty strengthens the mind as labor does the body. This applies directly to your thinking. The moments when it is hardest to control your mind are the moments that build your ability to do so. If you avoid those moments, you remain weak. If you engage with them, you become stable. Over time, this changes your relationship with your thoughts. You stop seeing them as something you must follow and start seeing them as something you manage. You no longer depend on feeling good to think clearly. You create clarity through practice, regardless of your emotional state. This is where real control begins. Not when your mind is calm, but when it is active and you can still guide it. Because discipline removes dependence on mood. It allows you to operate the same way whether you feel confident or uncertain, calm or pressured. It creates consistency in how you think, which leads to consistency in how you act. And that consistency builds something deeper. Trust. You begin to trust your ability to handle your own mind, to not be overwhelmed by it, to not be controlled by temporary states, to maintain direction even when things feel unstable. And once that trust is established, something shifts. You are no longer fragile. You are no longer easily affected by what happens around you. You begin to develop a form of internal strength that does not depend on external conditions. But if your mind becomes disciplined, what happens when nothing outside can disturb it anymore? Becoming untouchable from within. There is a level of control where the world around you does not lose its intensity, but it loses its power over you. Things still happen. People still speak. Situations still change. But something inside you no longer reacts the way it used to. You are not unaffected because life became easier. You are unaffected because you became stronger internally. This is what it means to become untouchable from within. It does not mean you stop feeling. It means your feelings no longer dictate your actions. It does not mean you stop thinking. It means your thoughts no longer control your state. You begin to notice something different. The same situations that once disturbed you now pass through without the same impact. The same words that once triggered you no longer reach the same depth. The same uncertainties that once created anxiety now feel manageable. Not because they changed, because you did. Marcus Aurelius wrote in Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, Book 6, Paragraph 8, that the mind can maintain its tranquility, even in the midst of chaos, if it refuses to be disturbed by external things. That refusal is not denial. It is discipline. You are no longer depending on the outside to feel stable. You are generating stability from within. This changes how you move through life. You stop seeking constant reassurance. You stop needing everything to go your way. You stop reacting to every shift, every opinion, every unexpected outcome, because you understand something clearly. What happens outside is not what defines your state. What you allow inside does. Epictetus explained in Enchiridion of Epictetus, paragraph 5, that if you want to be invincible, do not enter into battles where you do not have control. Your mind is the one place where you always have influence, if you choose to use it. When you develop this level of control, external events lose their ability to destabilize you. Criticism does not define you. Uncertainty does not paralyze you. Delays do not frustrate you the same way, because you no longer interpret everything as a threat. You see things as they are. Temporary, neutral, manageable. And this creates a different presence. You become calm in situations where others react. You remain steady when others become overwhelmed. You think clearly when others are driven by impulse. This is not something you announce. It is something people notice. But more importantly, it is something you feel, a sense of internal independence. You are no longer controlled by every thought, every emotion, every external condition. You have created space between what happens and how you respond. And in that space, you have built stability. But this stability comes with a realization. If nothing outside can control your mind, then everything depends on how you choose to use it. The day you stop being your own enemy, there is a moment when everything changes. Not because your life suddenly becomes easier, not because problems disappear, but because you are no longer working against yourself. For the first time, your mind is not creating resistance where there should be clarity. It is not adding weight to situations that are already simple. It is not turning uncertainty into fear or silence into meaning. It is steady. It observes before reacting. It questions before believing. It filters before accepting. And that changes everything. Marcus Aurelius wrote in Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, Book 7, Paragraph 67, that your life is what your thoughts make it. This is not a metaphor. It is a direct description of how your internal world shapes your experience. When your thoughts are chaotic, your life feels chaotic. When your thoughts are distorted, your reality feels unstable. But when your thoughts are clear, your life begins to feel aligned. You are no longer creating unnecessary conflict inside your own mind. That is the difference. Most people are not defeated by life. They are exhausted by the constant tension created by their own thinking. They fight battles that exist only in their interpretation. They carry weight that was never real. They react to scenarios that never happen. And over time, they believe this is normal. It is not. The moment you stop believing every thought, you break that cycle. You begin to see things as they are, not as your mind exaggerates them. You begin to respond based on reality, not assumption. You begin to act with clarity instead of reacting with emotion. Epictetus taught in Enchiridion of Epictetus, paragraph 10, that what upsets people is not what happens, but their judgment about it. When you change that judgment, you change your entire experience. This is where your power has always been, not in controlling the world, but in controlling how you interpret it. And once you understand this, something shifts permanently. You stop searching for perfect conditions. You stop waiting for everything to feel right. You stop depending on external outcomes to feel stable, because you realize that your peace was never outside. It was always in how you think. And now, You are no longer reacting blindly. You are choosing. Choosing what to believe. Choosing how to interpret. Choosing how to respond. This is the day you stop being your own enemy. And from this point forward, your mind is no longer a place of conflict. It becomes a place of strength, a place of clarity, a place that works with you, not against you. And when that happens, you do not just change how you think, you change how you live.